Aliens, aliens, aliens. 1950 was such another banner year for UFO and UAP history that we're having to break it into sections and still only bring you mostly CE3 and CE4 cases. Why do you think there were so many cases all around the world in 1950? Please let us know in the comments section below. In this episode, we'll be looking at 9 interesting cases, including places such as Bahia Blanca, Brazil, Amarillo, Texas, White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, Abate Guaton, Italy, Lago Argentino, Santa Cruz, Argentina, Mojave Desert, California, Kauai Island, Hawaii, Rio Gallegos, Santa Cruz, Argentina, and Mineral, Washington. These videos are a labor of love. If you like this kind of content, please give this video a like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss a thing. Are UFOs and UAP real?
The truth is that we've never proved one, but there are things flying around up there that we haven't fully identified yet.
UFO and UAP have been here for a long time.
There's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are.
UFO and UAP are a global phenomenon.
I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
These close encounters are categorized into 5 different categories. It's 1950 and we're in Bahia Blanca in the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. We have a close encounter of the 4th kind. Dr. Enrique Caretenuto Bota was an ex-war pilot and famed aeronautical engineer before he began working as an architectural engineer at 40 years of age for a large company out of Caracas, Venezuela. They sent him to a remote area near Bahia Blanca in the state of Rio de Janeiro to work on an ambitious and large construction project. He decided to drive there and had an unusual encounter along the way that would be the strangest experience of his life. Dr. Bota was driving along the highway in an isolated area of Bahia Blanca. He had been traveling for miles in the desert terrain with not much to catch his eye until he saw something strange up ahead just off the road in the grass. It was strange enough that he stopped his car a ways off to take a better look as he thought it might be a crashed airplane or something like that. Instead, what he saw was a disc-shaped craft sitting on the grass. After watching it for a few minutes and seeing that there was no observable movement, he decided to get even closer and got back in his car and drove up to it. At first, he thought that it was a private jet that made an emergency landing, but as he got closer, he saw that this structure did not look like a helicopter or an airplane at all. The object was made of a very strange material that looked metallic in appearance, but felt more like rubber or even a sponge to the touch. Bota examined this disc for several minutes and then walked around it from the other side and saw a dark hole. At that moment, he was more curious than scared and decided to climb inside. At first glance, the craft's inside seemed empty except for a blinking red light and a dome top. As he ventured further inside, he saw a curved divan with 4 seats. 3 of these seats were occupied with small beings about 4 feet tall, with gray, tight-fitting jumpsuits. The 3 small creatures were facing a control panel. It consisted of lights, gauges, and meters of different types. Bota called out to them but received no answer, so he succumbed to an irresistible urge to reach out and touch the shoulder of one of them. When he did this, he claims that he could feel that the body was tough and the surface of the skin in the open area around the neck had a charred texture. It seemed that these people, or whoever they were dead. This discovery was enough to scare Bota badly and trigger a panic attack that forced him to jump outside, get into his car, and drive away. Arriving at his hotel, he related his strange experience to 2 of his closest friends. The group of men armed themselves with weapons and decided to return to the scene of Bota's encounter. However, it being almost dark and the area being so isolated, they changed their minds and opted for the next morning to do their search. Early the next day, Bota led the 3 directly to the spot of the previous day's unusual encounter, but there was no craft there now. All that was found at the site the object had occupied was a pile of ashes. One of the men scoops him up. Immediately his hand turned purple and remained that way for several days. The 3 men, discouraged by the absence of the object, began to look around the area to see if any other evidence of its landing could be found. One of the men looked up and saw 3 objects in the sky. One of the largest of the 3 was cigar-shaped, while the 2 smaller objects were disc-shaped. Dr. Bota hurriedly took 5 pictures of the objects, of which only 2 showed vague images of the objects. These strange objects hovered above them for several minutes before suddenly merging into one, after which this single object shone with a red light and dashed off at breathtaking speed, leaving eyewitnesses stunned on the road. Botha claimed that for several days after this bizarre incident, his friend's hand was still purple where he had touched the ash heap, and that he himself suffered from intense fever, as well as from unexplained blisters on hands and something like sunburn on the skin that lasted for several weeks. He also had an impression of the sunglasses he wore into the craft on his face. A test showed no sign of radiation. The doctors Botha consulted could not find any reasonable cause for these physical symptoms. It's April 10th of 1950. We're in Amarillo, Texas, and we have a close encounter of the fourth kind. Cousins David and Charles, 12 and 9, saw a disc land behind a hill. They touched it and got sunburned. The two boys attended River Road School in the 6th and 3rd grades and told their remarkable tale to a group of reporters. They had gone fishing just before 11 in the morning in a local creek. Before they could even catch a fish, they sighted a small object in the distance, about 20 degrees above the horizon, coming from the south. As the object got closer and slowed down, they could see that it was not a balloon. It was a small UFO disc, about 3 feet wide, and it passed just a couple feet over the boys' heads. David shouted to Charlie, "I bet that's one of those flying saucers, Charles. I'm going after it." Charles did not follow. David said the disc circled slowly and disappeared over a small hill to the north and landed before he could reach the top of the hill. It was about as big around as an automobile tire and about as high as my knee, maybe 1.5 feet. I could see it good, David reported. It was rounded on the bottom and had a top part that resembled a flat plate. The top was separated from the bottom by a space about 1/2 inch in depth. The top and bottom sections were held together by something like a screw. David said that, "When I came over that hill, the thing was only a little ways from me, and I ran a ways and dived at it. My fingers just barely touched it, and it felt slick, sort of like I guess a snake would. It was hot, too." Before he could get a hold of the craft, the top began revolving faster, made a sort of whistling noise, and took off without warming up or anything. It disappeared into the northeast in a straight line in under 10 seconds, he estimated. As the craft took off, it emitted some kind of gas or spray that made David's arms and face turn red and break out in little welts. David explained that when he first saw it, the bottom was still, but the top was spinning around real fast. There was a little top piece that was not spinning and must have been connected to the bottom. The craft was blue-gray in color and had no openings of any kind other than the space between the top and bottom sections. When the craft was taking off, the little space in the middle glowed red. When David got home, his father was surprised to see his son's red skin and the welts, as he did not have them earlier in the day and it wasn't sunny. It's July 4th of 1950, and we're at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. We have a close encounter of the fourth kind. From the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico where he worked, Fry had planned to join the July 4th evening festivities in nearby Las Cruces, but missed the last bus. Finding the bachelor's office quarters where he stayed too hot, he decided to explore a path in the desert he had never been down. There, Fry claimed a 30-foot diameter, 16-foot high oblate spheroid landed in front of him, and he talked remotely with the pilot who operated the craft from a mothership 900 miles above Earth. Fry claimed he was invited aboard and flown over New York City and back in 30 minutes. During the flight and subsequent meetings, Fry asserted that he talked with a pilot named Elon, who gave Fry information on physics, the prehistory of Earth, including Atlantis, Lemuria, and the foundations of civilization. Fry published several books about his experience and founded Understanding Inc., a nonprofit dedicated to preparing humanity for their eventual inevitable meetings with other races in space. It's April 24th of 1950. We're in Abate Guazzone, Italy, and we have a close encounter of the third kind. Bruno Faccini was at home in the evening and had gone out to use the outside toilet, which at the time was the only one available in the new house he shared with his wife and his young son. It had been storming heavily and had just let up. After finishing, he was walking back to the house and noticed strange flashes. He first believed they were part of the storm, but then realized they were coming from a field opposite their house. As he walked over to take a closer look, he saw around 200 yards in front of him a huge dark shape, like a ball with a flattened top. It was around 30 feet high and 20 feet across. A green glow illuminated a set of ladders which stretched to the ground below. It was then that he could make out the shape of what he at first thought to be a man, an American airman perhaps. He was wearing a heavy-duty type suit, a kind that years later, when interviewed about the case, Faccini likened to those worn by the Apollo astronauts on the moon missions. It looked to Faccini that the man was welding something. Perhaps he was performing repairs on a highly advanced and top-secret aerial vehicle. He would soon, however, get a closer look and would realize whatever the object was, it wasn't a U.S. military vehicle. It wasn't anything terrestrial at all, and neither, for that matter, were its apparent crew. A door would open along the side of the mysterious craft, a secondary glow emerging from inside providing more light. From the brief glimpse he got of the interior, he could see another ladder leading to a higher level. He could also make out bottles connected together in rows, while in between them were gauges and tubes. A little unnerved but awash with curiosity, he cautiously stepped forward. He could see two different figures now, each moved around the craft with slow and clumsy movements. Again, years later, after seeing the footage of the moon landings, Ficini would liken how the astronauts moved to how these strange creatures were moving now. At the time, he would state, "I guess their suits were heavy and slowed down their movements." He could make out a pipe that one of the figures was attending to with an unknown device. Every now and then a shower of metallic sparks would fly into the air, creating the flashes that had first alerted him to the strange activity now unfolding before him. As his angle changed, the more detail of the interior he could take in. He could see many dials and cylinders along the walls. The closer he got, the warmer the surrounding air felt against him. In fact, it was unusually warm, as if he stood near something pumping out steam. He also became aware of an uncomfortable buzzing sound like a giant beehive. The sound was constant and is of particular interest as it is another of the seemingly insignificant details that seem to crop up in many close contact UFO encounters. He could see several figures moving around under the craft. Still thinking they might be American servicemen, he stepped a little closer. He noticed that each figure had a helmet with a dark mask or visor in place. From this came a large flexible pipe that he assumed went to an oxygen tank. Perhaps, he thought, the storm had caused the craft to make an emergency landing for repairs. Thinking he might be able to help, he stepped forward until he was within only a few feet of the scene. It was then he realized they weren't Americans or any other country's air pilots. They weren't human at all. He heard guttural languages coming from the figures. He also noticed how they moved stiffly and made strange gestures. When one of the gestures was made towards him, he realized they were aware of his presence. Although one part of him reasoned they may wish to take him on board, the other part went into complete fright. He turned and ran as fast as he could. However, as he did so, he could see out of the corner of his eyes that one of the figures was pointing something in his direction. A sudden bright beam filled his vision. The next thing he knew, he felt as though he was cut in two parts by some cutting tool. He fell to the ground. He was still in one piece, but with a burning sensation running around his torso. Ficini managed to view the subsequent events without having to move from his position on the ground. The figures continued with their repairs for several minutes before returning inside the craft. The door on the side shut, cutting off the light that had been pouring out of it. The buzzing sound grew louder and the craft suddenly took off, gained speed, and disappeared. He would later state that despite the bright beam forcing him to the ground, the figures appeared not to be interested in me anymore. It was Ficini's belief that they merely wished to scare him away from the scene. His fear was more fear of the unknown as opposed to a feeling of being in danger. He would remain on the ground, however, for several minutes after the silence took over. Then, sure the strange visitors had left, he got to his feet and returned home. He wouldn't sleep well, if at all, that night. He would return to the site the following day, partly out of curiosity, but also due to having lost his cigarette box, which he believed he dropped when he was hit with the beam. Once there, he noticed 4 distinct circular impressions arranged in a distinct pattern. It was also clearly visible that the grass had considerable burn markings, and furthermore, numerous pieces of scrap and melted metal littered the ground. There was no doubt to Ficini these were the remains of the repairs he had witnessed only hours earlier. Ficini would make a report of the encounter to the police. Although they did attend the scene, reports suggested that they were far from enthusiastic about investigating the incident. They did send several pieces of the strange metal fragments for analysis, though. The results, while inconclusive as to exactly what they were, would state them to be a heat-resistant anti-friction metal. More interestingly, they would also offer the material would be ideal in spaceflight to face the burnup as the craft re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. A secondary examination of the materials a year later would state that the main composition was bronze with traces of lead. Ficini would also see a doctor about persistent back pain following the encounter. Upon examination, a black mark, darker than a bruise, stretched across his entire back. It remained for several weeks. Several UFO researchers investigated the incident over the years. To his credit, Ficini never once wavered from his version of events. That, as well as the recovered materials and the markings on the ground at the scene, surely ranked the encounter as one of the most credible on record. It's 6:30 p.m. on March 18th of 1950, and we're in Lago Argentino, in the governorate of Santa Cruz in Argentina, and we have a close encounter of the third kind that's become a classic in Argentine ufology. Wilfredo Arevalo was driving his truck 32 kilometers from Lago Argentino along the route that connects it with the town of Comandante Luis Piedrabuena in the governorate of Santa Cruz. He owns a field there and trades in wool and leather. He was headed towards the lake when he saw, in the clear sky coming from the southeast at fantastic speed, two luminous points that were approaching the Earth. At first he thought that they were stars, but suddenly one of those lights took on a dizzying height and remained fixed in space. The other began to descend in pronounced circles at lower and lower altitudes until it landed softly on the ground 3 kilometers in front of him in the pasture field of La Blanqueada. Despite the distance, he was able to see that it was an extremely white, luminous, dense, and phosphorescent circular machine, from which bluish smoke emerged from the back. He started his truck and approached cautiously, thinking it might be some kind of jet plane from their military aeronautics that had crashed. He stopped his vehicle 150 meters away from that shining craft, realizing that this was not an airplane, but a strange, extremely curious thing from which came a dense bluish-green vapor that smelled strongly of burning benzol. The circular machine had a large rotating plane that constantly rotated like a Victrola record. Its structure seemed to be made of aluminum or some other very light metal, and it was strangely phosphorescent. In its middle part was located a large glass cabin or something similar in the shape of a dome, of dazzling transparency and clarity. Inside moved 4 extremely tall and slender men, dressed in white clothes fitted closely to their bodies. Those figures had to be at least 2 meters tall, calculating that the diameter of the cabin was 8 meters and that the rotating plane 15 meters. The crew of the machine seemed to have their bodies wrapped in something like cellophane covers, as their figures shone in a very strange way. Their faces were extremely pale, almost pure white, and their other proportions were normal and even graceful. They shone wrapped in those kinds of cellophane covers, and they managed to discover him because suddenly they illuminated him in a blinding way and looked at him like that for a long time. The intense luminosity of the transparent vault in which those tall men moved prevented him from perfectly seeing the white objects they used, but despite this, he thought he noticed 2 types of mirrors or camera lenses that rotated and moved continuously, and a number of devices similar to those used by dentists or on airplane dashboards. Despite this strange scene, he tried to get closer to verify who they were or if they have had an accident and needed help. The craft suddenly turned on its side and shot a beam of blue light at him and dazzled him. Suddenly, the machine began to expel intense blue smoke and a reddish-green flame from its rear, and rose as if propelled upward by a trampoline, emitting a soft hum, and in seconds it became a luminous point again up in the sky. At that precise moment, the other luminous disk that was stopped in space began to move, and in a few more seconds the 2 lights moved away at impressive speed in a northwesterly direction towards the border with Chile, leaving behind a bluish trail that vividly illuminated fields. He left there very impressed, and after arriving back at his house on Lago Argentino, he spent the rest of the day reflecting on what he had just seen. The next day, with 2 farmhands on horseback, he explored the field on which the luminous disk had landed, but could only find some broken and charred grasses at the landing site. Later he learned that others had seen the lights descend from the sky that night. It's January 1st of 1950, we're in the Mojave Desert in California, and we have a close encounter of the 4th kind. A flying disc-shaped object was found intact in the desert. It had 18 occupants in it, and they were all deceased but not burned. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is reported to have recovered the craft and its occupants. A photo of one of the aliens being kept in cold storage shows what appears to be a small human-like being, about 3 feet tall, with human-like eyes and oriental features. It has been reported that this was revealed in a memo from the New Orleans FBI branch to the director on March 31st of 1950. It's 6:30 p.m. on January 17th of 1950. We're on the island of Kauai, and we have a close encounter of the 1st kind. 5 people are enjoying a Kauai sunset at the beach when they notice a disc hovering over the water and then shoot straight up at high speed until it was out of sight. It's evening in January of 1950, and we're in Rio Gallegos, a province of Santa Cruz, Argentina. We have a close encounter of the 2nd kind. A 23-year-old man is walking at night along the shore of San Sebastian Bay. He saw a very brilliant and large disc-shaped object about 600 feet wide emerge from the sea and fly towards Rio Gallegos. Dead fish were found floating in the sea in the area where the disc had exited the water, and bits of metal were found. It's daytime on March 28th of 1950. We're on the highway between Morton and Mineral, Washington, and we have a close encounter of the 4th kind. While driving home to Centralia, Washington on a highway through the forest, Samuel Eaton Thompson, a retired railroad worker in his 70s, saw an 80-foot diameter and 30-foot tall object on the ground in a clearing in the woods. It was shaped like two saucers edge to edge and apparently made of a glowing sun-colored substance similar to plastic. Two naked, deeply tanned children, human in form but very attractive, were playing near the craft's entrance ramp. He approached to within about 50 feet of the saucer, which emitted a strong sun-like heat. Several naked adults, humanoid, attractive, and also deeply tanned, then appeared at the craft's door. After realizing Thompson meant no harm to them, they beckoned him closer. The crew consisted of 20 adults and 25 children, the latter from about 5 to 15 years of age. He spent about 40 hours with these people and reported that they were pleasant. He ate some of their food, fruit and herbs from their native planet. They were from Venus, he learned, and had stopped at Earth despite the fact that other Venusian saucers had been shot at by Earth-based military forces. Some had even been shot down. The Venusians further claimed, said Thompson, that they were vegetarian and that they never grew ill. Thompson also claimed the Venusians were naive and childlike. They did not know who had built their flying saucers and seemed to possess little to no curiosity. He was told that they had inherited the ship. There were 4 controls. They did not know how these worked. They only knew that to push one set of controls would take them to Earth, and to push another would take them back to Venus. They said they were sent to establish goodwill amongst Earth people, and that Thompson was the first person ever contacted on this planet. Thompson claimed to have stayed on the spaceship until March 30th. They took him on a trip, landing within 2 blocks of his house. He took a picture of the ship, but it came out so overexposed that he threw the film away. The beings were described as of average height, with tan skins, long brown hair, and large beautiful eyes. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to make sure you don't miss a thing.